Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and this is another edition of Fresh Red Kills. So if you're new to my channel, Fresh Red Kills is where I talk about the books I've recently finished reading. I'm going to be talking about two fiction books that I read in the month of November. If you're new to my channel, again, I don't really call what I do book reviews. These are just kind of informal discussions. My videos are unscripted and very informal. So it is what it is. So I'm going to be talking about The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain and Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. Both of these I read as part of the reading banned books challenge that I had decided to do really at the end of last year, beginning of this year, where a bunch of other booktubers are doing this as well. But essentially, looking at the list of banned books, or frequently banned books, or at least challenge books, and then seeing which books that are on my TBR, some of my shelves are back there, which ones match up. And I came up with about 10 of them, and I decided that in 2024 I would read them. So I was kind of running behind on some of my reads, so I got 2 of them done in November. And both these, I should also say, I also did audiobooks with. I am somebody who loves audiobooks. I don't often talk about audiobooks on my channel, partly because I only ever listen to audiobooks that I also have physical copies of. The way that I like to read audiobooks or read books with audiobooks, I like to go back and forth. Sometimes I just do immersive reading, where I'll listen to the audiobook and read at the same time. Sometimes I'll listen to the audiobook in my car, and then I come home and I go back through those physical pages and I kind of skim through them and I look for things maybe that caught my ear, something maybe I want to reread. And then sometimes I'll keep reading and then I'll listen to that section again when I'm driving in the car. So when I do audiobooks, sometimes I'm not just like, I don't just rely on the audiobooks. I'm sort of in the process of always like reading and rereading. So that's why I don't really talk about that much on my channel, because I still read the book, even if it was in different chunks. So anyhow, just so you're aware of that, I listened to both of these and read them, but I listened to these because they had celebrities who I happen to like reading them. So Elijah Wood did a reading of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and Bryan Cranston did one of The Things They Carried. So I'll talk about those very briefly when the audiobooks, when I get to each of these books. So let's start with The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Now, this is a book that I know that I read, or at least I was supposed to have read, in high school. When I was assigned books in high school, I would sort of read them, kind of read maybe half of them. I was a reader back in high school, but I wasn't necessarily all too concerned with, reading the books that were being assigned to me. I was more reading my own thing. And I know that we read this in high school, but I'm thinking as I went through this again, I might have only gotten through like half the book, because half the book seemed kind of familiar to me. I really didn't remember much about the second half. And I knew the basic story here, but there were a lot of details I didn't remember. One of the things that I forgot, or maybe I just didn't appreciate when I was a teenager, is just how funny the book is. There's some really, really good humorous scenes in here, with different characters, with turns of language, with situations, absurdities. So I was, I guess, pleasantly surprised to find out that this was actually a very funny book. Now, of course, the reason that this is on those banned books or most challenged books lists is because of the frequent use of the N-word. And it is frequent. I think it's over 200 times inside this book. And that, as a 21st century reader, can be challenging. It can be difficult to continually come across that. Now, of course, this book was published in the 1800s. I think it was originally, does it actually, this copy say? I've got one of those old Barnes & Noble copies. Just seeing if it was. I think it was 1880s that it was published, but I could be wrong. When I read older fiction, especially, I read them, basically in 2 ways in tandem. One, I read it just kind of as entertainment, but I also read them as historical artifacts, basically as a primary source for the time period. What can I learn about the time period from it? So it's uncomfortable reading the N-word over and over again, but it also reveals a great deal about late 19th century America, and how casual that word was flung around and used. And the person using it the most is our central character, Huckleberry Finn. And the thing is, for 19th century standards, this is a fairly anti-racist book. Of course, looking back, in retrospect from the 21st century, we can find other problematic racist things in here, like stereotype characters, those sorts of things. I'm not going to go harping on that. That's not what this video is about. It's not really affecting my judgment of the book. I'm judging this as late 19th century literature. So just, be aware of it if you haven't read it before. But essentially, this is about Huckleberry Finn, the central character, a very adventurous young man who is not very prone to following rules. It's about his moral awakening, especially when it comes to slavery and race. So the book takes place, I think, in the 1830s or 40s. So it was written when slavery had been ended for at least 2 decades, but it takes place during the time of slavery. And we have this sort of friendship between Huckleberry and Jim, an escaped slave. And they're both kind of going down the Mississippi River together, getting into adventures. Jim is trying to find freedom. Huck has essentially faked his own death in order to escape an abusive father. So they're both sort of on the run. And what's most fascinating about the scenario here is Huckleberry Finn has been told, grown up believing that African Americans are basically property, that they are inferior, that he doesn't have to care about them in the way that he cares about whites. And he's been told that slavery is perfectly good. It is right. And yet he finds himself really becoming great friends with Jim and liking Jim and feeling for Jim. And he has to decide, what does he do? Does he help Jim escape, or does he turn him into the authorities? So we have this kind of wrestling with the way that something like slavery really twisted people's morality and logic. He thinks that if he's a good boy, he would turn Jim in. But he's a wicked boy, so he's going to help him escape. So he sees helping a slave escape as being wickedness, and he just kind of has to become accepting of that. Listening to Elijah Wood read it. Now, Elijah Wood, he did play Huck Finn in a Disney movie in the early 90s. And after I finished this, I watched that with my kids. I wanted them to, because I know they're probably not going to end up reading this in high school, because that's not the way that high schools really work anymore. I wanted them to be familiar with some, classic American stories. And also, I wanted them to, especially my daughter, because, my son can handle more. But I wanted them to be kind of exposed to some history of slavery. So we have a Disney sort of PG version of slavery inside that movie, but it's there. You see people being whipped. You see the lash marks. I thought that the movie actually did a really good job adapting this book for a more modern sensibility and sensitivities. That's one of the things that can be weird about this book, is it's dealing with things like lynching. It deals with slavery. And like I said, it's a funny book, but sometimes that humor comes, it's like, you're dealing with lynching and there's like sort of like, aw shucks moments. The kind of thing that I think that, adapting it today, you would need to have a lot more gravity and sensitivity with that sort of thing. And then also, watching that movie highlighted something else for me. So between reading the book, listening to Elijah Wood, and then seeing the movie's interpretation, there were certain things that really came to mind. The character of Jim, I think, is really fascinating. He's a character that you can read, I think, in a lot of different ways. In most instances, I think, Twain is sort of writing him as something of a stereotyped caricature. But there are moments where it really rises above that. There is a really great scene in here where Huck is basically playing a joke on Jim. And he thinks that Jim has just kind of fallen for it. But then Jim kind of reveals unexpectedly that he knows that Huck is tricking him and he doesn't appreciate it. And he lets Huck know just how hurt he is that he's doing this. And this is a major moment in Huck's moral awakening. He basically vows he doesn't ever want to hurt Jim's feelings again. and it's a great scene, but it lets you know that there's probably more going on to Jim than what we could expect here, that he's understanding more than maybe he's letting on. And there's a scene too where, I know I'm being very minorly spoiler, I'm not going to give away the ending here, but where Huck decides, no, I'm going to be a good boy, I'm going to turn Jim in. And Jim is saying to him basically like, oh, you're the only white friend that I've ever had, and the good old Huck. In the way that Elijah Wood reads it, it just seems like Jim is just kind of excited to have this friend. But in the movie, they do a really interesting thing with it, where it's the same dialogue, but Jim knows, he kind of knows that Huck is planning on turning him in. So when he's saying those things, he's trying to say it in a way to like change Huck's mind. And I think that it was a good reminder there's a lot of interpretation with that character especially that can go on, and how you read his dialogue, how you read what he says. Overall, I liked it. I think that the ending kind of gets wrapped up a little bit too neatly in a bow. I mean, I guess this is kind of considered kids' literature, and I don't think it should be, but I think it is considered like a young person's book. So things are wrapped up in a way where the sort of moral conviction and bravery that we had seen building up seems a little bit more deflated in how things get resolved. And we end up having Tom Sawyer, which, Tom Sawyer is where Huck first appeared in literature. And he kind of comes in, and you think that he's actually got a pretty good moral compass, but then when there's certain reveals, you realize you don't like him nearly as much. But anyhow, I did like it. I do think it's really well done. I think the humor is really good. I just kind of wish that the end had a little more of a punch to it. But anyhow, those are just my thoughts. Sorry, that was rambling. And then I'll be a little quicker with this one. The things they carried. So this was published, I think, right around 1990. Am I right about that? Yeah. And Tim O'Brien, he was in Vietnam, and this is kind of a strange book. Now, again, most people have read this. I didn't know what to expect going in. My first time reading it. So it's fiction, but it's based on things that O'Brien witnessed. At least some of it is. Based on things that happened to him or that he witnessed in Vietnam. The book is not so much about like combat. It's more about the ways that war affects soldiers psychologically, emotionally, in terms of their relationships. And we kind of have it's almost like a short story collection. There's vignettes going on that focus on various members of this company or platoon, and it's sometimes linear, sometimes not, and a lot of it really is about the sort of heavy weight, I guess the things they carried, the heavy weight of war on the individual, during war and after war, can I say, I hate it when you just lose that word, the indignity of dying in combat. There is no, brave death scene going on. It is just, you drown in feces. You have just piece of your mouth missing. You just drop like a sack of rocks. So it's those sorts of things, they're kind of like terrible situations that people find themselves in, this kind of hellscape of war. And it's not, again, about the battle. It's about the indignity of dying, of watching your friends die, and then of having to carry things like guilt and trauma with you. So I liked it overall. I did. It wasn't a gut punch type book for me. I will say that I found the kind of idea of mixing kind of fact and fiction. I understood it from an artistic point of view, how it could definitely be very valuable, and I thought it was interesting, but I'm somebody who kind of likes to know when something's real and what's not. Did this really happen or didn't happen? So that sort of thing, personally, can diminish my enjoyment at times. I like to have a little more of a clear line between fact and fiction sometimes. But anyhow, I liked it overall. So, we've got The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and The Things They Carry, 2 fiction books I read in November. If you've read any of these, love to hear your thoughts. And as always, thank you, BookTube.